In the hush of early morning, before the sun warmed the olive groves or painted the wheat fields gold, a quiet figure stirred in a modest earthen dwelling. This figure was no one of renown, no soldier, no scribe, no merchant, just a peasant, one of the many souls who lived, laboured and aged in the hidden folds of the Ottoman countryside. They did not choose this life. Few did. It was inherited, like the worn plough left by a grandfather or the calloused hands of a mother. Bound to the land by laws older than memory, they carried the burdens of empire not with protest, but with tired familiarity. The bonds of soil and law, the Ottoman countryside was divided not by fences, but by obligations. A great system structured their existence, the Siftain system, a name soft and strange upon foreign tongues, yet iron-bound in its meaning for those who lived under it. Families received land to work, not own. The state claimed the soil, but the sweat and hope poured into it belonged to the peasants. Each household was measured by how much land a pair of oxen could till, a sift. The family that could work it had the right to remain, generation upon generation. But this right was not freedom. It was duty. They could not sell the land. They could not wander far. To live under the system was to be rooted deeply, as an old olive tree that leans with time, but cannot flee the winds. The taxman cometh each season, brought not just rain and sun, but collectors. With them came the weight of dues, land taxes, livestock taxes, even taxes on the very breath of life for those who were not of the dominant faith. There was no waiting for a good harvest. Taxes were certain even when the wheat withered or the sheep perished in the frost. Sometimes the state did not collect directly. Instead, it auctioned the right to gather these taxes to wealthy men, tax farmers who sought profit, not fairness. These men might come with ledgers and guards, speaking in clipped tones, expecting more than the fields could yield. The peasant bowed low, not from reverence, but exhaustion. There was no arguing with the tax, only quiet payment, or punishment. The rhythm of survival. Before the sun rose, the village stirred. Men walked with slow, practiced steps toward the fields. Women carried water from communal wells, their backs straight despite the years. Children scattered to chase chickens or carry wood, their laughter rare, fields of barley, vines of grapes, groves of fruit. These were the lifeblood of the village, but tending them was ceaseless work. The soil offered little comfort, just the bare promise of survival. Homes were made from what was at hand: mud bricks, stones, straw. Inside, a fire burned low. Bread was baked from coarse flour. Milk, when there was a cow or goat. Meat, seldom. There were no books, no schooling for most. A boy might learn a prayer or two at the mosque. A girl might learn to spin, to cook, to endure. The ladder that never reached. Above them, far above, were others, men of swords and silk, scholars and judges, traders whose ships kissed distant shores. The peasant watched them only in glimpses, when they passed on horseback, or when one came to collect a debt. To climb that ladder was a dream one did not dare dream aloud. The world was arranged, and their place was fixed. The empire needed their labour, but not their voices, and if one was born a Christian or a Jew, life bore an extra burden. There were more taxes, more rules. Still, many bore them with quiet dignity, for even in hardship, faith provided its own kind of wealth. A life shared, not chosen yet, in the folds of this hard life, there was also a kind of peace. The village was a world in itself, a place of shared sorrows and rare joys. When a child was born, the women gathered. When someone died, they wept together. Weddings, feasts, and the sacred calendar offered brief light between long shadows. At night, under skies unspoiled by smoke or city, stories were told. Of heroes, prophets, and distant wars. Of the Sultan in his grand palace, a man of legend. And always, there was music, a flute, a drum, a voice that carried old songs across the fields. They did not call their life suffering. they simply called it life. Closing whisper in, the still hush before dawn, a peasant awoke once more. He rose not from ambition, but duty. The plough waited. The soil, familiar and unforgiving, beckoned. This was life under the Ottoman sky, a life of service, a life of simplicity, a life, in so many ways, forgotten. But it was lived. As dawn spilled over the sloped tiled roofs of an Ottoman town, the streets slowly stirred. Chickens clucked in shadowed corners, and the scent of baking flatbread mingled with the morning mist. Though the city may have appeared peaceful in those quiet hours, beneath its surface stirred 1,000 small tensions, everyday burdens shouldered by cobblers, porters, spice sellers, and seamstresses. Unlike the countryside, where life beat to the rhythm of the plough and harvest, the towns and cities of the Ottoman Empire hummed with a different energy, restless, crowded, often unforgiving. For many who lived behind stone walls and within twisting alleyways, urban life offered not freedom, but a different set of chains. The clamour of the market. The heart of any Ottoman town was its bazaar, a sprawling maze of wooden stalls, tightly packed shops, and darkened caravanserais. Here, merchants shouted their prices, peddlers moved swiftly through the throng, and labourers hauled heavy sacks on sun-browned backs. The air was thick with spice, sweat, and the sharp sound of bargaining. Yet, behind the noise lay struggle. Most townsfolk were not wealthy merchants but small artisans, apprentices, and shopkeepers. The guilds, known as esnaf, governed trade, offering some structure but also strict hierarchy. To become a master, one had to spend years in servitude, learning the craft, obeying rules, and often waiting until old age to earn real independence. And even then, competition was fierce. Prices could not rise beyond guild-set levels, meaning one's earnings remained tightly constrained. A poor season, a failed shipment, or a wealthy rival could undo a man's entire livelihood. Housing, walls close and crumbling for the common city dweller. Home was a narrow, often leaning building tucked behind other narrow buildings. Space was precious, and light seldom reached the interiors. Families shared rooms. Courtyards were shared by many households. Privacy was rare. Clean water, rarer. Still, streets, unpaved and winding, turned into rivers of mud in the rainy season. Waste was tossed from upper windows, and the smell clung to the air. Disease found easy prey among these close quarters, and when illness came, it came not for one home, but for whole neighbourhoods. Fire was a constant fear. The tightly packed wooden homes, the open flames used for cooking, and the dry winds of summer made the city a tinderbox. One errant spark could devour an entire district before the town criers had finished shouting the alarm. A delicate social dance life in the city demanded more than labour, it demanded navigation. Social customs were strict. Who could walk where, when, and beside whom mattered. Men and women had designated spaces. The mosques, coffee houses, and bathhouses served not only religious or practical purposes, but also shaped the unseen threads of social hierarchy. Urban women, especially in Muslim families, were often confined to the home. Their roles, though vital, were largely invisible to the outer world. Managing households, raising children, preparing food, these were their dominions. Some, particularly widows, or those in poorer quarters, engaged in trade from home, selling cloth, embroidery, or food from behind screens or through intermediaries. Non-Muslims, though officially protected, had a different rhythm of city life. Christians and Jews lived in separate quarters, followed separate laws within their communities, and bore additional taxes. Though coexistence was possible and often peaceful, it was never quite equal. The long reach of authority in every Ottoman town, authority wore many faces. There was the Qadi, the judge, whose word carried weight in all legal disputes, from inheritance to theft. There were local governors and tax officials, often more feared than respected. Justice was uneven. Wealth and connections swayed decisions. Bribes, though not officially sanctioned, were part of the invisible machinery that kept the city running. If one lacked coin or favor, one often lacked justice. The Janissaries, once noble soldiers, had by later centuries become a powerful urban presence. They walked the streets not merely as warriors, but as landowners, shopkeepers, and political actors. Their protection could be bought or their wrath incurred. Dreams deferred. For young boys apprenticed in workshops, there was often little time for play. Their hands grew calloused before their voices deepened. Dreams of travel, trade, or change remained dreams. The city might be vast, but the paths within it were narrow. Education, where it existed, was primarily religious. Madrasas taught the Quran, jurisprudence, and calligraphy, but few could afford such learning unless they belonged to families of means or standing. For most, life taught other lessons of patience, negotiation, and silent endurance. Urban poverty was not always visible, but it was widespread. Beneath the dignity with which people carried themselves lay anxieties of illness, of debt, of sudden eviction, moments of light. Yet the Ottoman city was not without joy. Even the poorest found solace in the rhythms of tradition. The call to prayer echoed through the streets, a sound both grounding and eternal. On Fridays and feast days, the city changed. Stalls closed, ovens filled with sweet pastries, and families dressed in their best. There were storytellers who gathered crowds in corners of the bazaar, spinning ancient tales. There were puppet shows, shadow plays, and travelling musicians. The hammam offered warmth, cleansing, and a brief escape from crowded homes. Even a small cup of bitter coffee shared in silence could soften the day. People survived not only through labour, but through community. Neighbours helped one another. Children were raised collectively. Weddings and funerals reminded all that. Though life was hard, it was shared. Closing. Whisperer's night returned to the town. Lights dimmed behind shutters. The streets, once loud with trade and talk, fell silent save for the soft steps of a watchman or the distant echo of prayers. In the quiet, the townsfolk lay in their beds, listening to the breathing of family, the creak of beams, the memories of another long day. Their dreams were modest, yet fierce. A better harvest, a fairer tax, a full belly, a healthy child. Behind the city's walls, the struggle continued. But so did hope. In the Ottoman world, faith was not just a private whisper to the divine. It was a presence woven through every moment, every corner of life. From the earliest morning light to the fading hush of night, religion shaped how people lived, prayed, married, mourned, and judged one another. Yet this all-encompassing presence, for all its solace and structure, was not always gentle. In many ways, faith in the Ottoman Empire was a binding force, beautiful in ritual, but also constraining. In its reach, to live under the Sultan's gaze was to live within a carefully ordered hierarchy of belief. And in that hierarchy, not all prayers were equal. The dominant faith, Islam in structure and spirit, for the Muslim majority, Islam offered comfort, purpose, and identity. The call to prayer echoed 5 times a day from minarets tall as pride. In towns and villages alike, it marked the rhythm of life. Work paused, heads bowed, and for a moment, even the poorest soul stood equal before God. Mosques were not just houses of worship. They were schools, courts, soup kitchens, and centers of public life. The ulama, the scholars of the faith, interpreted law, led prayer, and acted as intermediaries between the people and divine justice. Yet this structured piety brought limits. Daily obligations, ritual washing, prayer, fasting, almsgiving, required time and discipline. For the overworked poor, these acts could be both spiritually uplifting and physically draining. The fasting month of Ramadan, with its long daylight hours, was especially hard on labourers. And though faith taught compassion, the state enforced conformity. A Muslim who strayed too far from orthodoxy who questioned, resisted, or worshipped differently risked being branded a heretic. Such labels were dangerous. They could strip a man of his property, his safety, even his life. Dhimmis, protected. Yet burdened, those who did not follow Islam, chiefly Christians and Jews, were officially known as dhimmis, the protected people. This protection was both a shield and a leash. In theory, they were free to worship, keep their traditions, and live within their own communities. In practice, this freedom came at a cost. The jizya, a special tax, was levied upon all adult non-Muslim men. It was a visible reminder of their different status. Though many paid it without complaint, it marked them as outsiders in their own cities. There were other rules. A Christian could not ride a horse in the presence of a Muslim. A Jewish merchant could not testify against a Muslim in court. Churches and synagogues could not be built taller than mosques, nor could their bells or calls to prayer be louder. Clothing laws, too, sometimes marked the difference. A particular colour, a type of headwear, a sash. These laws were not always enforced strictly, and in more tolerant periods, life for dhimmis was relatively peaceful. But at other times, especially during political unrest, they became targets of suspicion, scapegoats for imperial failure. Religious courts and daily consequences. Each religious community had its own courts, millet systems that allowed Jews and Christians to resolve disputes according to their own laws. Marriages, divorces, inheritance, even business contracts were overseen by religious leaders rather than secular judges. But this autonomy came with limits. In cases involving Muslims, Islamic courts prevailed. And while communities could rule themselves internally, they remained subject to the overarching authority of the empire. For many, especially women, this meant navigating a complex legal landscape. A Christian woman married to a Muslim man might find herself caught between two legal systems. A Jewish widow might lose her inheritance if her case crossed into a Muslim court where different rules applied. The blending of civil and sacred law gave great power to clerics, but often left the common people at the mercy of their interpretations. The spiritual elite and mystics, not all religious life was rigid or official. Throughout the empire, especially in rural areas, Sufi mystics offered a more intimate, emotional path to God. Their gatherings, often musical, poetic, and deeply symbolic, attracted both the devout and the curious. Sufi lodges were places of healing, charity, and learning. They also provided an outlet for those weary of the formalism of mosque and state. The whirling dervishes with their mesmerizing dances expressed a longing for union with the divine that words alone could not convey. Yet the state did not always approve. At times, Sufi orders were embraced and patronized. At others, they were viewed with suspicion, too independent, too popular, too uncontrollable. Faith as social control religion in the Ottoman Empire was not merely personal, it was deeply political. The Sultan, as Caliph, was not only a king, but the protector of Islam. His legitimacy was tied to religious authority. In return, the religious establishment reinforced the state's rule. Friday sermons praised the Sultan's name. Religious festivals were occasions for imperial generosity, but also imperial visibility. The blending of mosque and monarchy left little space for dissent. To challenge the Sultan was to risk being labelled not just a traitor, but an infidel. This intertwining of faith and power ensured obedience, but stifled questioning. It fostered unity, but discouraged diversity. It built a world of order and silence. Moments of sincerity. Yet for all its weight, religion was also a source of private comfort, a mother lighting a Sabbath candle, a shepherd murmuring a verse under the stars, a child repeating prayers by heart beside his grandmother. These quiet acts, passed from generation to generation, outlived empires. They stitched meaning into harsh, our lives. They reminded people that beyond the tax, beyond the rule, beyond the court, there was still the sacred, still the mystery, still hope. Closing. Whisper beneath the towering mosques and humble chapels. behind the scriptures and sermons, lived millions of souls trying to do what was right in the eyes of their God and their rulers. They bowed their heads. They followed the rites. They whispered their fears and longings into prayer. Not all found peace, but all in their own way searched for it. In the hush of a shaded courtyard, away from the sounds of merchants and muezzins, Ottoman women tended to the quiet rituals of life. They kneaded dough, soothed infants, embroidered linens with patient hands. They laughed in small groups, shared grief in whispers, and waited, always waited. In many ways, theirs was a world unseen, their lives tucked behind stone walls and drawn curtains, their movements bounded not by distance, but by expectation. In the Ottoman Empire, gender was more than identity. It was a path laid out long before, a child's first breath. And for most women, that path was narrow, lined with duties, silences, and a carefully measured kind of respect. A girl's beginning, from the moment of birth, a girl's future was already being shaped. If born into a wealthy household, she might be wrapped in silks and lullabied to sleep with poetry. If born to a peasant or artisan, her swaddling might be simpler, her lullabies folk songs passed from grandmother to mother. But regardless of class, her training would begin early. By the age of 7 or 8, she would be learning how to clean, to cook, to serve. If she was lucky, she might learn to read, especially if her family had ties to the religious or literary elite. But for most, education was domestic, learning how to tend a household, how to obey, and eventually, how to mother. Marriage, a woman's fate. Marriage was not just a milestone, it was destiny. A girl was usually wed by her early teens, often to a man much older. In the countryside, matches were arranged to secure land or livestock. In the cities, it might be a dowry or family alliance. She rarely chose her husband. The decision lay with her father, her uncle, sometimes her brother. A formal agreement was drawn, a bride price exchanged, and a wedding held. For a brief day there might be music, henna celebration. Then the veil was drawn, the door shut, and a new life began. Marriage granted a woman status, but also confinement. Her days now revolved around her husband's household, his needs, his family's demands. If he was kind, life could be bearable, perhaps even content. If he was cruel or indifferent, she had little recourse. Divorce existed, but it was rare and difficult, especially for women without powerful male relatives. Widows, though sometimes freer, often faced poverty unless they remarried swiftly. The private realm. Harem and hearth, for many, the word harem evokes visions of luxury and indulgence. But for most Ottoman women, the harem was not a palace, fantasy. It was the domestic space, the realm of women. It could be grand in elite homes, but in ordinary dwellings, it was simply a room or two where women lived, worked, and raised children. Here, women built their own networks. Mothers-in-law ruled the space, younger wives learned to navigate their moods, and daughters watched silently. These private worlds were filled with stories, with quiet rivalries, with bonds stronger than law. In wealthier households, concubines might be present, slaves brought from distant lands whose fates depended on their beauty, wit, or luck. Some rose to great influence, others vanished into history, unnamed and unremembered. Clothing and the veil, or charshaf, was both fabric and symbol. In public, women, especially Muslim women, covered themselves according to local customs. In cities, this meant loose, robes, headscarves, face veils. In villages, the rules were more flexible, though modesty was always expected. The veil was meant to protect a woman's honor, to signal her family's status, to guard her from the gaze of men, but it also limited her mobility, her visibility, her voice. Some women embraced it as tradition. Others felt it as weight. It could offer protection in a dangerous world, or serve as a daily reminder of the spaces women could not freely enter. Work, wealth, and quiet power. Despite the restrictions, Ottoman women were not entirely without influence. In many towns, widows ran inns or small shops. Women brewed and sold food, spun cloth, wove carpets. In villages, they worked alongside men in the fields. Some women owned property, usually inherited from parents or husbands. Sharia law allowed women to hold and manage their own wealth, and court records show them buying land, lending money, and settling disputes. Elite women, especially those in the imperial harem, wielded political power behind palace walls. Some, like Qasem Sultan or Hurrem Sultan, influenced sultans, arranged marriages, brokered treaties. But such stories were exceptions, not rules. For most, power came quietly, through resilience, resourcefulness, and the unseen labor that sustained their families. Motherhood and legacy. To become a mother was a turning point. A woman who bore sons gained new respect. Her status rose within the family. Her opinions carried more weight. Yet motherhood brought endless toil. Nursing, teaching, feeding, worrying. Infant mortality was high. Disease, hunger, and poor sanitation claimed many young lives. Women often bore multiple children in hopes that a few would survive. Still, amidst the grief, there was joy. First steps, first words, a daughter's wedding, a son's safe return from military duty. These moments shone like lanterns in the long tunnel of daily labor. Faith and reflection religion shaped a woman's life deeply. Prayer, fasting, almsgiving. These were not only personal acts, but expectations. In the home, women kept religious traditions alive, lighting Sabbath candles, reciting Quranic verses, preparing foods for feast days. Few women had formal religious education, but many were deeply devout. They turned to saints and healers, visited shrines and whispered prayers for children, husbands, health. For some, faith was a refuge. For others, a cage. Yet in both joy and sorrow, it offered structure, a compass in a world of shifting expectations. Closing whisper behind every courtyard door, behind every veil, behind every pair of watchful eyes, lived women whose stories were rarely told. They were the heartbeat of the home, the keepers of memory, the silent architects of generations. Their lives were not easy, their freedoms limited, but in their strength, in their patience, in their quiet endurance, they shaped an empire. In the silent stillness before dawn, when the stars still lingered above minarets and markets, a different kind of awakening stirred within the walls of Ottoman garrisons. The clink of armor, the scrape of sandals on stone, and the low murmur of command broke the hush. These were no peasants, no tradesmen. These were janissaries, soldiers of the Sultan, guardians of the throne, and shadows of fear in every corner of the empire. To the world beyond, they appeared proud and invincible, but within the iron frame of the janissary core lay a complicated web of control, sacrifice, and quiet torment. For those forced into its ranks, glory often came at the cost of identity, freedom, and peace. The origins of obedience. The janissaries were born from a system known as devshirme, the collection. Young Christian boys, taken from their families, in the Balkans, Albania, and beyond, were selected by imperial decree to serve the Sultan. These children, sometimes no more than 8 or 9, were wrenched from home, language, and kin. They were not chosen randomly. Officials sought strong, intelligent, obedient boys, those who could be molded. Once taken, the boys were converted to Islam, given new names, and plunged into a strict world of discipline, silence, and service. Their pasts were stripped away. In their place, a single truth remained: loyalty to the Sultan above all else. The boys who entered this system rarely returned home. Their identities blurred with time, and though some rose high, becoming generals, governors, or even viziers, their journeys were paved with loss. Life within the core, to be a janissary, was to live under constant discipline. Uniformed in distinctive hats and sashes, they moved as one. They trained relentlessly, marching, shooting, drilling in formations that inspired both awe and terror. Their days were filled with repetition, their nights with silence or whispered prayers. They lived together, ate together, and often died together. Their barracks were both home and prison, tight quarters with strict codes. Brotherhood was essential, but privacy was a dream. Forbidden from marrying for most of the Corps' history, Janissaries were meant to belong to no one but the state. Their hearts were not to be shared with family or lover. Their allegiance was singular and unyielding, yet some, in time, broke the rules. As the centuries passed, the Janissaries began to settle, marry in secret, build lives outside the barracks. But this only added tension to an already brittle structure. Power and corruption at their height, the Janissaries were a fearsome fighting force. Disciplined, loyal, nearly invincible, they were the Sultan's sword, used in conquests across Europe and the Middle East. Their presence on the battlefield often turned the tide of war. But as power gathered, so too did corruption. Over time, the Janissaries gained political influence. They controlled sections of the economy, collected taxes, owned shops, and involved themselves in local affairs. They became gatekeepers not only of war, but of wealth. When discontent brewed within their ranks, they did not hesitate to rebel. Sultans were pressured, viziers assassinated, entire reforms undone by the will of Janissary factions. They could make or unmake rulers. Their allegiance, once absolute, grew conditional, bought with gold or promise. Such power bred fear. In cities where Janissaries were stationed, townsfolk walked carefully. A wrong word, a suspected insult, could spark reprisal. The same men meant to protect now loomed as unpredictable lords. The toll of forced devotion, for the young boys who had once been plucked from distant hills, the transformation into soldier was rarely painless. Though clothed in silk and steel, many bore unseen wounds. The loss of language, family, and faith left deep scars. Some never forgot their homes. In dark moments, they whispered names no one around them knew. Others clung to new identities fiercely, seeking meaning in the only world they had left. Not all adapted. Some fled. Some resisted. And some quietly broke beneath the weight of forced devotion. For each who rose to power, many more simply endured, living lives of strict order, forbidden desire, and quiet longing. The fall of the elite. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the Janissary Corps had grown bloated and unruly. Recruitment changed, Dev Shirmi faded, and Ottoman-born Muslims were allowed in. Discipline eroded. The once feared force became fragmented, unpredictable. Repeated rebellions shook the capital. Sultans, fearing their own soldiers, dared not reform them. They became a state within a state, protectors in name, but parasites in practice. Finally, in the 19th century, a bold sultan, Mahmud II, acted in what came to be known as the auspicious incident. The Janissary barracks were surrounded. The corps was declared illegal. Thousands were killed or imprisoned. Their era ended in smoke and fire. The streets that had once trembled beneath. Their boots now bore only the silence of ghosts. Echoes of service. Yet not all memories were bitter. In some regions, Janissaries were remembered with honor. They had defended cities, fed orphans, maintained order when no one else would. Their traditions, songs, and brotherhoods left marks in culture and story. Their legacy was complex. They were heroes and villains, victims and tyrants. Above all, they were men caught in a machine far larger than themselves. Closing whisper as night folded over the empire once more. A lone figure might stand in the quiet of a garrison, long abandoned. The wind through broken shutters carried whispers, not of glory, but of duty fulfilled and freedoms lost. For all their might, the Janissaries were never truly free. Their strength was bound by chains invisible, yet unbreakable. And in the stillness of history, their march still echoes, faint, distant, fading. In the hush before sunrise, when the fields still wore their veil of mist, and the villages stood quiet in slumber, a sound more feared than thunder approached. A knock on the door, the shuffle of boots, the voice of a collector. The taxman had arrived. In the vast mosaic of the Ottoman Empire, few figures inspired such quiet dread as the tax collector. Neither warrior nor king, he nonetheless wielded the power to upend lives, to seize what little one had, and to reduce seasons of toil into silence. His shadow stretched from stone alleys in the capital to the farthest olive grove on the empire's edge. Taxation in the Ottoman world was not just a duty, it was a yoke, one that bore down heavy on the backs of those least able to bear it. Labyrinth of levies. The empire's wealth did not flow from mines or machines, but from its people, peasants, artisans, herders, merchants, and from them, the state demanded its due. Taxes were many, varied, and relentless. There was the resm-I sift, the core land tax paid by peasant households, the adat-I anam, a tax on sheep and goats, the avaras, an extraordinary tax levied during wartime or emergencies. For the grain, the wine, the honey, the market stall, even the millstone, there was a fee, and then there was the saizi, the poll tax on non-Muslims, a tax on one's very existence, paid in silver, marked with signatures and stamps and fear. The weight of these obligations did not fall equally. Those with wealth or influence could negotiate, bribe, or delay. The poor could not. The iltizam system, profit in others' pain. Perhaps the most punishing element of the Ottoman tax system was not the taxes themselves, but how they were collected. In many provinces, the state outsourced this duty through a method called iltizam, tax farming. Under this system, wealthy individuals bid for the right to collect taxes in a region. The highest bidder paid the state up front and then set about recouping their investment, plus profit, by gathering taxes. From the people, this was a business, and in business, mercy was seldom profitable. Tax farmers often sent agents, known for their harshness. If taxes were unpaid, property could be seized. Oxen, grain, even the very roof above one's head. Appeals to fairness were seldom heard. The law favoured the collector. For the common folk, this meant living under dual pressure, owed to the state, but hunted by men who had paid dearly for the right to take even more. The rhythm of fear for peasants, the tax season was a time of anxiety. Families hid valuables, sold livestock early, borrowed from neighbours. Children were hushed, meals went thin, and prayers thickened. It was not uncommon for entire communities to face ruin from a single bad harvest. Yet the tax remained. There were no relief programs, no forgiveness forms, only the collector's list and the quiet desperation of the indebted. Some fled, others fell into servitude. Debt spiraled. Sons left villages to seek work in cities, hoping to send money home. Daughters were sometimes married off hastily, not for love, but to lighten a family's burden. And always, the next levy loomed. Markets and merchants, no shelter from the squeeze urban dwellers, did not escape the taxman's reach. Markets faced tolls. Storekeepers paid for their stalls, their scales, their walls. Artisans were taxed on tools, workshops, raw goods. Even the water wheel that ground a village's grain came with a government fee. Merchants fared no better. In every town they passed, a toll. On every bridge they crossed, a toll. At every port they anchored, a customs duty. To trade was to pay, and to pay was to hope one's profit might remain when all was said and done. Smuggling, bribery, and avoidance became survival tactics. But the risks were great, and the punishments harsh. Tax and faith, a heavy distinction. Though the empire allowed religious diversity, it also monetized it. Non-Muslims, while protected under the dhimmi system, were often taxed more heavily and with less flexibility. The saizi was not merely a financial burden. It was a marker of difference. Paid annually, often under public scrutiny, it reinforced a quiet humiliation. Even wealthy Christian or Jewish subjects knew this ritual well, a reminder of their place in the imperial order. Sometimes the poor were exempted, but more often the burden fell hardest on those with the least. And in times of war or famine, their suffering was compounded. The collector's power, to the tax collector, the law was a tool and power a privilege. Armed with decrees and escorted by guards, he could demand, confiscate, and punish. He needed no invitation, no sympathy. Complaints could be filed with the Qadi, the local judge. But justice was slow and costly, and the tax had to be paid. While one waited, collectors often favored those who paid quickly or generously. Records were sometimes altered. The poor, who could offer neither silver nor favor, had no leverage. In remote regions, collectors became mini-lords, feared more than the distant sultan himself. For a villager, their word was final, their presence unwelcome, their absence a rare mercy. Rebellion and resistance. Throughout Ottoman history, tax revolts flared like sparks, quick, bright, and dangerous. Villages refused to pay. Roads were blocked. Collectors were attacked. But retaliation was swift. Soldiers were dispatched. Fines increased. Leaders punished. Resistance became its own form of ruin. Still, in whispers, resistance lingered. Stories were passed of brave men who had defied the taxman, of villages that vanished into the hills. Legends grew where justice did not. Closing whisper in. The Ottoman Empire, taxation was not merely a means of governance. It was a constant shadow over the lives of ordinary people. It shaped marriages, migrations, diets, dreams. It made the empire rich, but the people weary. As evening fell and coins were counted in a taxman's pouch, a widow sat by her hearth, counting the last of her lentils. Somewhere nearby, a child asked why the bread was thinner this year, and no one needed to answer. The tax had come again. In the stillness of an early Ottoman morning, as the sun slowly crept across clay rooftops and narrow alleyways, a young boy adjusted his simple robes and carried a wooden tablet under his arm. His destination was the mektep, the neighborhood school, where he would join others like him, seated cross-legged on the floor, reciting sacred words they only half understood. To many, schooling in the Ottoman Empire was a privilege, but for most, it was a complex mix of religious repetition, rigid discipline, and limited opportunity. Education promised knowledge, but delivered, more often, a narrow window into obedience and belief. The mektep and the madrasa. Two worlds of learning Ottoman education existed in two main forms. For the youngest children, especially boys, the first step was the mektep, a small primary school, usually attached to a mosque. Here, students learned to read and write, but the core of the curriculum was religious: memorization of the Quran, recitation of prayers, and basic rules of Islamic conduct. The tools were simple: a wooden board, ink, a reed pen. Lessons were chanted aloud in unison. Understanding was secondary to memory. Teachers, often elderly religious men, relied on repetition and strict discipline. A student who stumbled might feel the sting of a cane or the cold silence of shame. Those who advanced, typically the sons of the wealthy or elite, could attend a madrasa, a higher school for theology, law, grammar, and philosophy. These were grander places, sometimes funded by royal foundations. Here, instruction was deeper, and a select few emerged as scholars, judges, or scribes. But for the majority, such paths were far beyond reach. Who learned? Who did not in theory? Education was valued. In practice, it was deeply uneven. Boys were prioritized. Girls, especially in rural areas, rarely attended formal schools. There, education came at home, learning domestic skills, modesty, and obedience. In cities, elite girls might receive tutoring in poetry, manners, and religious instruction, often within the walls of the harem. Some learned to read and write, but few were encouraged to question or explore. Education for women was more refinement than empowerment. Among non-Muslims, schooling often took place within their own communities. Armenian, Greek, and Jewish children learned in separate institutions, taught in their own languages and faiths. While some flourished, others faced limitations imposed by imperial oversight. Access to education reflected the empire's social order. Those born to privilege received knowledge. Those born to labor received orders. A curriculum of conformity Ottoman education, especially in the mektebs and madrasas, focused not on creativity or inquiry, but conformity. The goal was to produce pious subjects, loyal to God, obedient to the Sultan, respectful of tradition. Lessons rarely touched on mathematics, science, or foreign knowledge unless it served religious interpretation. Poetry and history were taught, but selectively. Philosophy was often viewed with suspicion, and ideas from outside the Islamic world, especially Western thought, were either ignored or condemned. The empire's scholars were deeply learned in theology and jurisprudence. But the world was changing, and in many ways, Ottoman education remained bound to a past that no longer explained the future. The role of the teacher, revered and feared. The figure of the Hodja, the teacher, was central. Clad in long robes, turbaned, often bearded and solemn, he commanded respect. In some communities, his word rivaled the judges. Parents sent their sons with hope, reverence, and sometimes fear. But methods were harsh. Discipline was strict, and learning was more performance than understanding. Students who failed to memorize were scolded, isolated, or beaten. Tears in the classroom were not uncommon. A good teacher could inspire love of learning. A harsh one could silence a child's curiosity for life. There were exceptions, gentle scholars, poetic tutors, men of vision. But they swam upstream against an old river of custom, a path to power. For a few, for the ambitious, education offered one of the few ladders of social mobility. A bright peasant boy, taken under a patron's wing, might rise through the madrasa system to become a judge, mufti, or even an imperial advisor. But such stories were rare and the path narrow. Advancement required not only intellect, but connections, money, and obedience to the established order. Innovation was frowned upon. Independent thought was risky, and those who rose often found themselves caught in another web, bureaucratic, political, and ultimately just as binding as the lives they had left behind. Women who defied the silence. Despite the odds, some women found ways to learn. In Istanbul, some wealthy families hired private tutors for their daughters. In certain Sufi circles, women were taught poetry, theology, and even music. A few left behind letters, poems, or journals, fragile but enduring echoes of a hidden literacy. These writings, when discovered, revealed longing, intelligence, and dreams no less vivid than those of men. But they also spoke of loneliness, of being unseen, of knowledge as a secret joy carried quietly through a world not made for them. Education in the empire's twilight, by the 18th and 19th centuries, pressure for reform grew. Western schools began to appear in port cities. New sciences, technologies, and languages, once dismissed, found cautious entry into elite academies. But change was slow. Resistance was strong. Many clung to the old ways, fearing that to loosen tradition was to unravel the fabric of faith and empire. The world marched forward, and the Ottoman schools remained for too long in the shadows of their own past. Closing whisper in the quiet of a forgotten classroom, where ink has dried and wooden tablets gather dust. One might still hear the echoes of young voices reciting verses, some with reverence, others with weariness. Education in the Ottoman Empire promised light, but too often delivered walls. It shaped minds, but mostly to fit, not to fly. And in the hearts of many, questions remained unanswered, not because they were too difficult, but because they were never asked. As twilight fell over the crooked alleys and lantern-lit streets of an Ottoman town, the air took on a stillness, not of peace, but of careful watching. Somewhere in the shadows, a figure moved silently, not a thief, but the watchman. He tapped, his staff on the cobblestones in slow rhythm, announcing his presence. Order in the empire was always near, but so too was fear. Maintaining peace in a realm so vast and diverse required more than laws and prayers. It required watchfulness, enforcement, and, at times, punishment. But the face of justice in the Ottoman Empire was not always kind, nor fair. It wore many masks, some wise, others cruel. And for the common folk, the line between safety and suffering was often thin and shifting. The Qada in the courtroom, at the heart of Ottoman justice, stood the Qada, a judge trained in Islamic law, often respected, sometimes feared. Each town or district had one, and his courtroom was a simple place. A wooden bench, a scribe with ink-stained fingers, and scrolls of law. It was here that disputes were settled, from stolen goats to unpaid debts, from divorce to assault. The Qada was meant to be impartial, guided by both religious law and imperial decrees. In his court, the words of the Quran shared space with the Sultan's orders, but justice depended heavily on who stood before him. A poor farmer and a wealthy merchant might both plead their case, but not always on equal footing. Bribes, though discouraged, were not uncommon. Influence whispered behind closed doors. And for those who could not afford a proper scribe or a skilled witness, truth could be easily overshadowed. Law and the streets, the role of the watchman in cities. Order was kept not just by law, but by presence. Night watchmen, or bekçi, patrolled the neighborhoods with staffs and lanterns. They listened for cries of help, for clanging iron, for the silence that signaled something was wrong. During the day, market inspectors known as mutasibs ensured fair prices, honest weights, and public morality. A baker who sold underweight bread could be punished. A tavern owner serving wine to Muslims might be fined. Even public affection, loud singing, or inappropriate dress could draw their notice. But these enforcers were uneven in their application. Some were honorable, protecting the weak and chasing down true criminals. Others used their power to settle grudges or demand favors. The people learned quickly which watchmen to greet and which to avoid. Punishment, swift, harsh, and public when crimes were committed, punishment often followed swiftly. The Ottoman legal system favored deterrence over rehabilitation. Justice was a spectacle, meant to be seen and feared. A thief caught red-handed might lose a hand. A murderer, his life. Public flogging was common, for liars, cheats, adulterers. The square became a theatre of pain, where the community gathered not to judge, but to witness. Stocks, beatings, and brandings were used liberally. In more serious cases, execution was carried out with solemnity, often beheading, sometimes hanging. Heads were displayed as warnings. Crime, the empire believed, could be managed by memory, yet not all punishments were physical. Fines, exile, and forced labor were also tools of the court. A man might be sent to work in a distant province, never to see his family again. A woman might be ordered to remain indoors for months as penance. And in rare cases, mercy was shown, often at the intercession of the powerful or the pious. Prisons. Walls of waiting, Ottoman prisons were not places of reform, but of holding. Dark, cramped, and unsanitary. They were meant to contain the accused until judgment, or the condemned until execution. Prisoners often relied on family or charity for food. Guards were few, and corruption was common. The strong ruled the weak, within the walls, and disease spread like smoke in winter. Some inmates remained for years, forgotten in paperwork or awaiting trials that never came. Others were released quickly, if they could pay, or if their case held little interest. Children were rarely imprisoned, but women sometimes were, particularly those accused of adultery or sorcery. Justice for whom? Justice in the Ottoman Empire was not blind. Religion, gender, and class shaped its application. Muslims enjoyed privileges in court, able to testify against non-Muslims, receiving lesser penalties in some cases. A Christian could not easily win a case against a Muslim without strong evidence or a Muslim witness. Women could appear in court, and some did so frequently, especially in cases of inheritance. dowry, or domestic abuse. But their word carried less weight, and their access to justice was often filtered through male guardians. Slaves, too, had rights under Islamic law, but those rights were often ignored. Their bodies were cheap, their suffering invisible. For the powerful, justice was a tool. For the powerless, it was often just a hope. Resistance and redemption. Despite its flaws, the justice system was not without light. Some cadres were known for wisdom, fairness, and humility. Some watchmen risked their lives for strangers. Some prisoners found repentance or were freed by acts of compassion. Sufi orders, in particular, often offered sanctuary to the accused, especially those seeking spiritual redemption. A thief might become a dervish. A woman cast out by society might find shelter in a lodge. These were not the rules of the empire, but the kindnesses found within it. Acts of mercy that softened the harshness of law. Closing whisper in the quiet. Moments after judgment, after the sentence was passed and the onlookers dispersed, the city settled once more into uneasy order. But beneath the peace lay tremors of fear, of injustice, of the long shadow cast by the empire's need to control. Justice in the Ottoman world was a delicate balance. It upheld order, but often at the cost of fairness. It punished swiftly, but forgave slowly. And in the hearts of many, justice remained not a promise, but a question. Far from the marble mosques of Istanbul and the orchards of Bursa, where the empire's voice grew faint and its presence blurred into mountains, deserts, and distant seas, there lived another kind of Ottoman subject, forgotten but not free. These were the border dwellers, the keepers of edgelands where the Sultan's hand reached only loosely, and where danger arrived more often than help. To live at the edge of empire was to live with constant uncertainty. The border was not a line on a map, but a shifting horizon, where loyalty was watched, threats loomed beyond hills, and the protections of imperial citizenship wore thin. Here, life was shaped not just by the laws of the Sultan, but by the winds of war, the rustle of smuggling, and the footsteps of passing armies. The landscape of the margins, the Ottoman Empire stretched vast and wide, from the chilly Carpathians to the sands of Arabia, from the Black Sea shores to the rugged coasts of North Africa. And in all these corners, terrain shaped the people who lived there. In the Balkans, steep mountain passes shielded villages from easy access. In the Arabian frontier, the desert swallowed cities and split tribes. Along the eastern borders with Persia, vast plains turned violent during each new campaign. Communication was slow, roads were poorly kept, messages travelled by caravan or courier, often arriving too late to matter. Governors ruled semi-independently, enforcing imperial law when it suited them, ignoring it when it did not. The people of these regions learned to live without expecting help. The weight of defence. For many border communities, life meant defence. Raids were common, by rivals, rebels, or simply desperate neighbours. Armed men came in the night. Crops were burned, sons conscripted, daughters hidden away. The empire demanded loyalty, but gave little in return. Fortresses were built, then abandoned. Garrisons rotated soldiers too few in number, poorly paid and often indifferent. Some families raised militias, others paid local bandits for protection. The line between soldier and outlaw blurred in the hills. Even the most loyal villagers learned to negotiate with those who threatened them, offering tribute to one side today, then to another tomorrow. And always the taxes came, carried across dangerous roads, counted by indifferent scribes in far away. Cities, smugglers, traders, and survivors. The empire's borders were not just sites of violence, they were also arteries of trade, both legal and illicit. Caravans passed between Ottoman lands and neighbours. Venetian traders in Dalmatia, Persian merchants in the east, nomads across the deserts. Where imperial tariffs were high, smugglers thrived. Tobacco, silk, salt, and spices were moved in silence, through forests, and across rivers. The empire punished such activities, but rarely stopped them. Border towns became strange blends of danger and opportunity. A man might be a farmer by day, and a muleteer for contraband by night. A widow might bake bread for the garrison and shelter rebels in her cellar. Survival demanded compromise. Morality bent in the winds of scarcity. Faith and identity in flux. Religious identity at the borders was complex. In some regions, Christian and Muslim villages existed side by side, their customs shaped as much by local tradition as doctrine. Intermarriage, though discouraged, was not unknown. Languages mingled, names blended, but suspicion always lingered. Converts to Islam were watched for sincerity. Christians were pressured to display loyalty, paying taxes promptly, flying no, foreign flags, avoiding rumors of alliance with imperial enemies. In times of peace, these tensions slept. In times of war, they burned. Accusations of spying or betrayal could tear apart communities. A village once loyal could be emptied in a day, its people branded traitors, its homes given to others. And the imperial court, hundreds of miles away, rarely took notice. Living between empires to live on the border was not only to live on the edge of the Ottoman world, but often within reach of another, Habsburg, Russian, Persian, or European colonial powers. These neighbors watched closely, offered deals, stirred dissent. Rebel leaders in the Balkans sometimes fled across mountains to Habsburg lands. Arab tribes near British-controlled territories negotiated their own fates, playing one power against another. Armenian and Kurdish communities along eastern edges balanced uneasy relations with both the Ottoman and Persian courts. The result was a world of shifting alliances and unstable peace. A village might raise Ottoman banners one year, and another's the next. Loyalty was not treason, but necessity. And those who failed to shift quickly enough often paid with blood, neglect, and isolation. Perhaps the greatest burden of border life was neglect. Roads remained unbuilt, schools were scarce, doctors were few. When drought came, no help arrived. When plague struck, the border folk buried their dead and prayed it would pass. Imperial officials visited rarely. When they did, it was often to collect taxes, conscript men, or issue warnings. Their presence brought demands, not aid. And when they left, they took what little was left behind. Some communities built their own systems, judging disputes locally, educating children with traveling clerics, healing the sick with herbs and prayer. But even these small comforts were fragile. In winter, isolation grew thick as snow. In summer, unrest rode with the heat. Whispers of rebellion. From these edgelands came many of the empire's revolts. Discontent festered quietly, then rose suddenly. A tax too high, a land dispute unresolved, a local leader mistreated, and the hills erupted. Some uprisings were quickly crushed, others smouldered for years. In the Balkans, in the Arabian Peninsula, in eastern Anatolia, songs were sung of lost sons, broken promises, brave standoffs. The border folk were not merely victims, they were resilient, proud, and fiercely attached to their land. But they were tired too. Tired of carrying the burdens of an empire that often forgot they existed. Closing whisper, at the edge of empire, where the flags flutter weakly and the maps blur, life was lived in grey. It was neither fully Ottoman, nor truly free. It was hard, often thankless, always uncertain. But in these borderlands, the spirit of survival shone strong. In hidden valleys, in caravan shadows, in lonely towers, people endured, despite the silence from the centre. And as the empire strained to hold itself together, it was here, in the cracks and corners, that it began to come undone. In the soft dawn light of a village nestled among Anatolian hills, a mother stirred the coals beneath a clay oven, stretching dough into thin rounds with practiced hands. She glanced at her children, still sleeping under woven blankets, and whispered a prayer. If the bread rose well, if the well stayed full, If the sheep remained healthy, today might be a good day. But in the Ottoman Empire, such days were rare luxuries. More often, life tiptoed along the edge of hunger. Bread and water, simple things, fragile things, could decide a family's fate. A poor harvest, a spoiled storehouse, a closed road, and everything could unravel. Beneath the grand palaces and flowing turbans, the empire was held together by the thin thread of food, and too often that thread frayed. The peasant's table, simple, sparse, and repetitive. For the vast majority of Ottoman subjects, peasants in the countryside, the diet was dictated by the seasons and the soil. Wheat was the core. Barley, lentils, and chickpeas followed. Most meals revolved around bread, often coarse and hard. Porridge and boiled grains made the rest. Meat was rare. A chicken was a treasure, a sheep, a fortune. Dairy, milk, yogurt, cheese was more common, especially in herding communities. Eggs came when hens cooperated. Vegetables grown in home gardens filled the pot when available. Onions, garlic, greens, flavoring a stew stretched across many. Mouths, fruits were seasonal and dried for winter. Spices were a luxury. Olive oil, if present, was used sparingly. The peasant's table was not empty, but it was seldom full. Urban diets, variety with limits. In cities and towns, markets offered more variety, but not for all. The wealthy dined on lamb stews, saffron, rice, stuffed vegetables, and sweets dripping in syrup. Merchants and officials could afford coffee, pastries, imported fruit. But for common workers, food was still a struggle. Bread from the bakery, lentil soup from the corner stand, olives wrapped in cloth for a midday meal. Street food existed. Roasted chestnuts, boiled chickpeas, pickled turnips. But it was a treat, not a staple. And when prices rose, even city folk tightened their belts. A failed harvest hundreds of miles away could empty stalls and inflate prices by week's end. Grain and empire, a fragile web. The Ottoman state depended heavily on the stable flow of grain. Granaries were built in key cities, and caravans moved supplies across deserts and mountains. Governors were expected to maintain stocks. Taxes were often paid in kind: wheat, barley, millet. Yet this system was easily disrupted. Bandits attacked grain convoys. Weather ruined crops. Corruption diverted supplies. A delay in one province could ripple across 5 more. In theory, the empire had emergency reserves. In practice, they were poorly managed, hidden for profit, or left to rot. When famine struck, it was rarely from complete lack, but from failure to distribute, and those who cried out the loudest were often the last to be heard. Famine and its faces. The Ottoman Empire suffered numerous famines across centuries. Some came with drought. Fields turned to dust. Wells ran dry. Animals dropped dead in the heat. Others came with plague. Laborers vanished. Food spoiled. Fear spread faster than hunger. One of the worst struck during the early 1600s. War had emptied the countryside of men. Locusts devoured crops. Grain prices doubled, then tripled. Families ate grass, bark, anything. Parents watched their children shrink. In urban centres, bread riots broke out. Bakers were accused of hoarding. Authorities struggled to calm the crowds, but offered little relief. In rural areas, entire villages emptied, some through flight, others through quiet death. Starvation did not come dramatically. It crept, it waited, and it lingered long after the rains returned. Water. Life's other fragile thread. If food was a struggle, water was an equal trial. In dry regions, wells were sacred. Springs were guarded. Canals and aqueducts, when functioning, brought life to cities. When broken, they brought disease. In some towns, women walked miles to fetch water, balancing jugs on their heads. In others, fountains offered free access, but only during certain hours, and often with long queues. Contamination was common. Sewage mixed with drinking sources. Epidemics followed. cholera, dysentery, fever. In summer, water was a blessing. In winter, it was a test. Frozen pipes, mud-choked streams, a sudden flood that swept away grain stores or drowned a child. And still, every day, people rose early to seek it. Charity and the hungry Islamic tradition encouraged feeding the poor. Soup kitchens, called immerets, were built across cities, often attached to mosques or funded by pious foundations. These kitchens served stews, bread, sometimes rice to the hungry, orphans, widows, travelers. But resources were limited. Priorities were shaped by politics, religion, and favoritism. A well-connected widow might eat daily, a peasant stranger only when a surplus allowed. During Ramadan, donations rose. Feasts were shared. But after the lanterns dimmed, hunger returned. Even charity in the empire was subject to hierarchy. Rationing and riot. When shortages became severe, the state intervened. Grain was rationed, prices were fixed. Inspectors patrolled bakeries. Black markets bloomed in the shadows. People lied about family size. Bakers hid flour. Officials took bribes. And when patience ended, revolt began. Not grand revolution, but sudden violence. Looted stores, stoned officials, burned wagons. The empire punished swiftly. But even punishment could not fill empty bellies. Closing. Whisper in the kitchens of the poor. Silence often spoke louder than pots. A mother tore flatbread into equal pieces, hiding her own hunger behind a smile. A child counted lentils as treasure. A father stared at a dry field, praying for rain that never came. Food and water, simple needs, became the greatest burdens, not for their absence alone, but for the way they revealed every weakness in a mighty empire. And as night fell across countless homes, the final prayer was not for wealth or peace or glory. It was for enough. In the heart of Istanbul, behind the towering gates of Topkapı Palace, beyond the gardens and golden domes, a solitary figure once paced across tiled courtyards, robed in silk, crowned with the weight of centuries. He was the Sultan, the shadow of God on earth, the emperor of emperors, ruler of millions. And yet, beneath his opulence lay another kind of prison. To be the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire was to hold absolute power, but also to carry unbearable responsibility. Surrounded by intrigue, rituals, and the constant whisper of expectation, the Sultan's life was far from free. He was revered, but rarely trusted. He commanded, but was also watched. And though his word was law, his days were rarely his own. The weight of legacy, each new sultan inherited not only a throne, but the memory of countless ancestors, conquerors, saints, tyrants. From Osman, the founder, to Mehmed the Conqueror, to Suleiman the Magnificent, their ghosts loomed large. Every decision a sultan made was measured against these predecessors. Was he just? Was he strong? Did he expand the empire, preserve its faith, uphold its glory? The empire expected greatness, and greatness was costly. A weak sultan might be deposed, a careless one assassinated. And so, the palace became both sanctuary and snare, a life of ritual and isolation. The sultan's days were bound in strict formality. He awoke to soft whispers, his meals presented in silence. Servants bowed low, eunuchs hovered, guards stood watch. Every movement was noted, every word weighed. Meetings with viziers followed rigid protocols. The sultan listened from behind screens. He did not speak casually, even to his closest advisors. Familiarity was dangerous. Authority had to be performed constantly, never relaxed, never doubted. His time was tightly managed. Prayers at set hours, audiences on fixed days, processions arranged to the minute. Even pleasure was structured, hunting trips, poetry readings, garden strolls, all watched, all choreographed. Behind the walls of luxury, the Sultan lived a life few would envy. The cage of the princes, Perhaps no symbol captured the empire's strange blend of power and paranoia like the cafes, the cage. This was not a cage of iron bars, but a secluded wing within the palace where royal princes were confined, often for years. Brothers, nephews, even sons of the reigning sultan were kept here in comfort, but isolation. Their contact with the outside world was minimal. Their education was limited, their futures uncertain. This policy arose from fear of rebellion, of civil war, of a prince rising against his kin. In earlier centuries, sultans had simply executed their brothers upon taking power. The cafes was a more merciful alternative, but it bred madness, melancholy, and despair. Many sultans emerged from this golden prison unprepared for rule. Some were gentle poets with no sense of state. Others were paranoid, cruel, or indecisive, shaped more by silence than schooling. Power. Without rest, though the sultan was absolute in theory, he was constantly beset by demands. Provinces rebelled, janissaries grumbled, foreign ambassadors requested favors, scholars petitioned, religious leaders debated law. Every crisis came to his door. The palace, while guarded, was not impermeable. Intrigue thrived. Spies served rival factions. Servants gossiped. Women in the harem vied for favor, not just for love, but for influence. The mother of the sultan, the Valid Sultan, often held great power, shaping policy behind the veil. Even decisions of marriage were strategic. The sultan married not freely, but carefully, aligning with powerful families, rewarding loyalty, securing alliances, and above all, he was expected to be more than human. Wise, just, brave, devout. Any faltering could unravel empires. The burden of image. The sultan's image was carefully cultivated. Portraits, public ceremonies, coins, and Friday prayers all reinforced his majesty. His clothing sparkled with jewels. His throne stood beneath. Golden canopies, his voice, rarely heard in public, was spoken of with awe. But this image came with pressure. He could not weep, even in grief. He could not hesitate, even in doubt. If illness struck, it was hidden. If loss came, it was softened. The sultan was allowed no ordinary emotion, only divinity cloaked in human form. Yet within his chambers, he aged like any man. He feared betrayal. He mourned lost sons. He suffered ailments. He questioned his worth. And he did so alone. From solitude to submission, some sultans retreated from the world. They let viziers rule. They stayed behind palace walls, emerging only for ceremony. They read books, wrote poetry, tended gardens. Their withdrawal was interpreted as weakness, and power slipped from their grasp. Others ruled with iron force, demanding obedience, punishing dissent, riding into battle themselves. But these sultans burned quickly. Their brilliance often ended in isolation or revolt. The throne gave everything, but it took everything too. Death and what came after. Even in death, the sultan's burdens did not end. Succession was rarely peaceful. Factions formed, messages flew, janissaries demanded payment for loyalty. Princes were recalled, watched, tested. Some never made it to the throne. Others ruled only briefly, falling to poison, sword, or quiet, strangulation. Their bodies were buried in grand tombs, beneath domes carved with verses. But their names were debated, their reigns picked apart, their souls, perhaps, still restless. Closing whisper, beneath the gilded halls and silken robes. The sultan lived not as a man of freedom, but of duty. He ruled an empire, but was prisoner to it. He wielded power, but was haunted by its price. In the silence of night, when the palace was still and the gardens swayed in the moonlight, he may have wondered if peace was possible. Not for his realm, but for himself. To rule was to serve. To command was to be consumed. And in the grand story of empire, even the greatest thrones carried chains. In the shaded courtyards of Istanbul's grand homes, behind the latticework of harem walls and along the dusty paths of caravan routes stretching from the heart of Africa to the shores of the Black Sea, lived a class of people whose names rarely made it into the scrolls of history, people bought and sold, used and forgotten, whose breath was counted in service to others. Slavery in the Ottoman Empire was not hidden. It was a quiet constant, woven into households, armies, markets, and palaces. From gilded eunuchs who guarded royal secrets to weary boys carrying jugs of water in back streets, enslaved individuals formed the invisible backbone of Ottoman society. And though their chains were often made of silk, they bound just the same. Who became a slave in the Ottoman world? Slavery had many faces. Some were prisoners of war, captured on the empire's endless frontiers, from the Balkans to the Caucasus. Others were children taken in raids across Africa, sold by tribal intermediaries, or handed over as tribute from vassal states. Girls were prized for youth and beauty, boys for strength and obedience. Fair-skinned captives from Circassia or Georgia were especially valued in elite households. Dark-skinned slaves, often from Sudan or Ethiopia, were assigned lower domestic roles or military support tasks. The reasons were not only racial, but cultural and economic. Beauty and exoticism became currency, and no matter their origin, these individuals lost their names, their language, and often their faith. The markets of flesh in Istanbul, Cairo, and other key cities, slave markets, operated openly. Transactions were regulated by law and official. Records were sometimes kept. Buyers inspected teeth, posture, skin. Sellers praised virtues, concealed flaws. Some were sold multiple times. Some were purchased young and raised in households. Others, too old or sickly, were cast aside, left to beg or die. Prices varied. A skilled concubine might fetch a small fortune, a field hand far less. But every transaction carried the same: quiet violence, one human owned by another. And all this took place beneath the domes of mosques, in cities of scholarship and piety. Slaves in the household, domestic slavery was the most common form. In wealthier homes, slaves cooked, cleaned, ran errands and nursed children. Women, especially concubines, were often brought into harems, some becoming favored companions, others fading into anonymity. Some households treated slaves with relative kindness. Bonds formed. Some were freed after years of service. A few, even, rose in rank, becoming stewards, tutors, or informal advisors. But many more endured lives of silent labor. They woke before the masters. They ate last. They slept lightly, always listening for commands. Their injuries were treated privately, their sorrows dismissed. There was little protection under the law. A master who killed a slave unjustly might be fined, but only if the case was brought, and few dared. Palace slavery, chains in silk. The palace operated on a different scale. Here, slaves were not only servants, they were institutions. Eunuchs from Africa guarded the harem. Female slaves were trained in music, dance, and courtly manners. Boys selected through the devshirme system became janissaries or bureaucrats. Some palace slaves gained immense power. The Kislar Aga, chief of the black eunuchs, held influence over royal affairs. Certain concubines became mothers of sultans, ruling indirectly through their sons. Their words could shape wars. Their whispers could shift policy. But these were rare fates. For every slave who rose, countless more remained in the background, faceless, voiceless, unnamed. Military slavery, the sword and the chain. Through the devshirme system, Christian boys were taken from their families, converted to Islam, and trained for the state. Many became janissaries, elite soldiers loyal to the sultan. Others joined the imperial bureaucracy. Technically, these boys were slaves, yet they held more power, wealth, and prestige than most free citizens. They wore armor instead of chains, and some became governors, generals, or viziers. But their fate was still not their own. They were not allowed to marry at first. Their allegiance was absolute. Disobedience was treason. And though some loved the empire they served, many remembered the families they had lost, the language they no longer spoke, the faith they no longer practiced. Religious justifications and legal boundaries, Islamic law, permitted slavery, but emphasized humane treatment. Owners were encouraged to feed, clothe, and shelter slaves as they did themselves. Freeing a slave was praised as a pious act. Abuse was frowned upon, but reality often betrayed ideals. Most slaves lived at the mercy of their masters. Laws were poorly enforced, and religious justification became a shield for exploitation. Conversion to Islam did not always guarantee freedom. A Muslim-born slave was rare but not impossible, especially if born to enslaved parents. Some slaves bought their freedom. Others were manumitted in a master's will, but many died in service, their names never written. Resistance and resilience. Despite their status, slaves resisted in quiet ways. Some escaped, though risks were high. Others formed secret networks, sharing language, culture, and memory behind. Closed doors, songs, dances, and oral stories kept alive identities lost in documents. A lullaby hummed in a native tongue, a prayer whispered at night. These were acts of survival, and when freedom came, by coin, compassion, or chance, it brought its own burdens. A freedman often had no land, no family, no clear place in society. Many continued to serve in similar roles, but now with fragile dignity. Freedom, like bondage, was complicated. Closing whisper in, the shadows of marble halls and bustling streets. Slavery endured in the Ottoman world, not as a horror loudly declared, but as a quiet engine, humming beneath the empire's grandeur. Its victims wore silks or rags, bore swords or brooms, sang for sultans or wept alone. They were not always shackled, but they were never free, and though the chains may have been gilded, they still weighed heavy on the soul. In the dry heat of an Anatolian village, where wheat rustled gently under the wind and time seemed to pause between seasons, the sound of hoofbeats shattered the peace. Riders bore imperial orders. Names were called. Sons were taken. Mothers wept quietly by doorways. A new campaign had begun. To live in the Ottoman Empire was to live in the shadow of war. For centuries, expansion defined glory, and with it came a hunger for soldiers, young, strong, and willing, or at least unable to refuse. From mountaintop hamlets to bustling towns, the empire's call reached far, and its cost was borne by many. War, though draped in banners and hymns, left behind more graves than gold. The machinery of conscription. The Ottoman military drew strength from multiple sources. The elite janissaries, trained from childhood, formed one core. But as the empire aged, they could no longer meet demand alone. So the state turned increasingly to levies, sekban, azap, and other irregular troops, drawn from the general population. A village might be required to send a number of men based on its size and wealth. The poorest gave their strongest. Sometimes, families paid substitutes. Sometimes, they had no choice. Those conscripted were not soldiers by trade. They were farmers, shepherds, blacksmiths, ill-prepared, ill-equipped, and often fearful. They marched not for glory, but because to refuse was to invite punishment, or worse, and once taken, they might not return for years. The Long March campaigns stretched for months, sometimes years. Soldiers marched through deserts and forests, across snow and swamp, from the Danube to the Nile. Supplies were scarce. Illness more dangerous than swords. Many died before seeing a battlefield. Food ran out. Boots wore thin. Tents collapsed. Fleas, lice, and dysentery followed every regiment. Water was filthy. Heat stroke in summer. Frostbite in winter. Those who survived became hardened, but not invincible. A musket ball, a poisoned wound, a stray arrow could end them swiftly. And often, no grave marked the spot. The campaigns themselves, the empire fought on many fronts, against Habsburg Austria, Safavid Persia, rebellious provinces, and later rising European powers. Wars were frequent, large, and devastating. Victories brought prestige, but were fleeting. Borderlands shifted like sand. Cities taken were often lost again within a generation. Sieges were long and brutal. Fortresses starved before they surrendered. Civilians were caught between empires, raped, killed, conscripted themselves. Fields were burned, wells poisoned, livestock stolen. Ottoman commanders, often far from the capital, made decisions with little regard for local lives. Their focus was on victory and favor, not mercy. The toll on civilians, for every soldier on the march, dozens remained behind. And they too paid dearly. Fields went untended. Harvests failed. Wives became widows. Children grew fatherless. Taxes increased to fund campaigns. Entire villages relocated, either by force or by fear. In frontier regions, war was not seasonal. It was constant. The same town might be taken and retaken, its people shifting language, religion, and rulers just to survive. Refugees swelled the roads. Disease followed them. Starvation waited at journey's end. Even in distant cities, the effects were felt. Bread prices rose. Orphans filled mosques. Soldiers returned broken, limping, blind, embittered. War and plunder. For some, war offered opportunity. Soldiers were promised ganimet, spoils, the right to loot captured cities, take property, seize prisoners. This practice, centuries old, was seen as payment for service. But plunder came with horror. Civilians suffered most. Churches burned. Women enslaved. Sacred books destroyed. Ottoman armies did not always spare fellow Muslims. If rebellion was suspected, no mercy was shown. Cities loyal one day might be punished the next. And though laws existed to curb excesses, they were seldom enforced in the heat of conquest. The slow decline, as the empire aged, its wars changed. No longer about expansion, they became defensive. Desperate, struggles to hold shrinking borders. The janissaries grew corrupt, provincial troops unruly, discipline faltered. The state tried to modernize, new uniforms, Western drills, foreign advisors. But resistance ran deep. Pride clashed with practicality. Many soldiers, trained in old ways, resented the change. And still, the wars came. Russia, Austria, Britain. Each campaign more costly than the last. Victories dwindled, retreats multiplied, and always, it was the common soldier and the peasant who paid first. Memory and mourning in every village tales were told. Of fathers who vanished in Syria, brothers lost in Hungary, sons who wrote one letter and then were never heard from again. Widows, dressed in black, graves went unmarked. Some kept helmets or sabres as tokens, silent symbols of sacrifice. Others cursed the empire in whispers. They prayed not for triumph, but for peace. Dreams of escape. Some conscripts deserted. They vanished into forests, fled to other lands, became bandits or wanderers. Punishment, if caught, was severe. Flogging, branding, or execution. Yet for many it was worth the risk. Freedom, even brief, was better than endless marching toward a war they did not choose, for a cause they did not understand. Closing. Whisper the empire called its soldiers asker, those who serve. But what they served, often, was not honor, nor glory, nor even homeland. They served duty, fear, obligation, the machinery of a state too vast to love its smallest parts. And in the quiet corners of the Ottoman world, where no drums beat and no banners flew, families lit candles for those who never returned. Not heroes, not martyrs, but men who had once been boys, now lost in the empire's long shadow. In the hush of a narrow alleyway, behind a modest home of mud, brick and timber, a child coughed through the night. The mother sat by the bedside, dipping cloth in water, murmuring verses. offering what comfort she could. But the fever did not break. By dawn, the child was still. Outside, life stirred again, but inside, silence lingered. Illness was a constant companion in the Ottoman world. It came without warning, struck without mercy, and left behind grief and questions no one could answer. From the crowded streets of Constantinople to the windswept steppes of the empire's edge, people lived not in fear of war or tax alone, but of sickness, invisible and relentless. The fragile body, in a harsh world life expectancy in the Ottoman Empire, was short. Infants often died before their first birthday. Mothers perished in childbirth. The strong were humbled by sudden fevers. The old, if they lived to be old, were often bent with pain. Hygiene was inconsistent. Clean water was precious, waste disposal primitive. In cities, waste flowed in open drains. In villages, it seeped into the earth. Contagion moved fast. One cough became many, one rash, a rash across a district. There were no warning systems, no trained medics on call, just worry and waiting. Common illnesses, uncommon pain diseases came in many forms. Some were seasonal, colds, flus, fevers. Others were perpetual. Tuberculosis, smallpox, malaria, waterborne illnesses like dysentery, and cholera swept through communities like fire. Insect-borne diseases followed stagnant water and warm months. Leprosy existed at the margins, feared, misunderstood, stigmatized. Those afflicted were isolated in colonies, pitied but avoided. Plague remained a terrifying spectre, though less frequent by the 18th century. Its memory haunted generations. Entire neighborhoods fled at its rumor. Doors were sealed. Prayers rose like smoke, and all of it unfolded in homes without beds, under roofs that leaked, beside fires that smoked more than warmed. The healers and their tools medicine in the empire blended ancient knowledge, folk wisdom, and religious tradition. Physicians, hekim, trained in major cities, reading Arabic translations of Greek and Persian texts. They prescribed herbs, bloodletting, baths, and charms. Their knowledge was vast, but not always helpful. Theories of humours guided much. Practice, balancing heat, cold, moisture, and dryness. Illness was often blamed on imbalance, bad air, miasma, or divine punishment. Apothecaries sold remedies, dried roots, oils, powders. Baths offered some relief. Public hammams were centres of both cleanliness and social life. For the poor, healing was often left to local midwives, herbalists, or wise women. Their remedies were passed down by word and memory. In desperate times, people turned to saints, holy men, and amulets. Mosques and churches served as spaces of both prayer and shelter. Faith was often the only medicine within reach. Childbirth, life and risk for women. Childbirth was both miracle and peril. Midwives assisted deliveries using herbal infusions, massage, and prayer. But without sanitation, infection was common. Many mothers died of postpartum complications. Many infants never took a second breath. Stillbirths, miscarriages, and death during infancy were spoken of quietly. Grief was folded into routine. Mothers tried again, sometimes with hope, sometimes just with duty. Surviving children were swaddled, breastfed when possible, and guarded from evil with charms. Blue beads, silver talismans, Quranic verses stitched into cloth. Children were not named until several days had passed, for many would not survive the week. Hospitals. Care and constraint, Ottoman Darüşşafaka, charitable hospitals, existed in major cities. These institutions were often linked to mosques, funded by religious endowments. They treated the poor without charge and housed the mentally ill with relative compassion. But capacity was limited. Medical knowledge was inconsistent. Hospitals were as much spiritual sanctuaries as healing centers. Treatment depended on the staff's skill and the patient's status. Most people never entered one. They healed or died at home. mental illness. Seen and unseen, mental health was not ignored in Ottoman society, but it was poorly understood. Those afflicted were sometimes cared for in hospital wards, where music, baths, and gentle restraint were used. Others were hidden, shamed, or abandoned. Explanations ranged from divine trial to possession. Families whispered of madness. Communities tolerated eccentricity only up to a point. Yet some Sufi orders welcomed those on the margins, seeing spiritual depth in madness, poetry in broken minds. In these spaces, the wounded soul found moments of dignity, epidemics, and state response. When Sivan epidemics struck, the empire responded slowly. City gates were closed, markets emptied, ships were quarantined, special burial grounds were opened. But understanding of contagion was limited. Measures were uneven. Wealthy families fled to countryside villas. The poor stayed and perished. Healers tried their best, often falling ill themselves. Afterward, life resumed. Streets were cleaned, graves blessed. But the memory remained, quiet and heavy, like soot after fire. Hope in the midst of suffering. Despite the pain, life continued. People cared for each other. Mothers sang lullabies even when afraid. Neighbors shared soup with the sick. Children chased each other through alleyways, forgetting yesterday's funeral. Healing, when it came, felt like a miracle. Recovery was celebrated with feasts, with prayers, with laughter barely hiding the relief. And knowledge grew, slowly. Observations passed from one hakim to another. Books were written. Ideas from Europe trickled in. A better future flickered on the horizon. But for most, the present was enough struggle. Closing whisper in the Ottoman Empire, death was not rare. It was a neighbor. Illness shadowed every birth, every harvest, every joy. The empire endured, but its people endured more quietly. Their battles fought not with swords, but with boiling cloth, whispered prayers, and stubborn hope. And each night, as lamps flickered in dark homes, another mother watched another child, her eyes heavy with worry, her heart full of love. She did not know if morning would bring health or sorrow. But she waited, because that is what life demanded. In the marble halls of Ottoman power, where voices echoed under gilded ceilings and scribes bent over parchment by lamplight, decisions were made that shaped lives far beyond the palace gates. Orders stamped with the Sultan's seal passed from hand to hand, crossing rivers and deserts, carried on horseback and wind. But as they moved, something changed. The ink remained the same, but the purpose often shifted. For every decree, a price. For every appointment, a gift. Behind the empire's grand facade, a quieter truth took root, one of bribes, favors, and silent deals. The Ottoman machine, once sharp and efficient, grew clogged with whispers and gold. And for the common folk, this unseen rot made life harder than the heaviest tax. The origins of decay. No empire stands forever. As the Ottoman domains expanded, so too did their complexity. Administration became vast. Layers of bureaucracy thickened. Governors ruled distant provinces with little oversight. Judges interpreted laws as they pleased. Tax collectors turned public duty into personal fortune. At first, these cracks were small, overlooked or tolerated, a coin for quicker justice, a gift to secure a license. But over generations, this behavior calcified into custom. Bribery was no longer exception. It became expectation. The cost of justice. In the local court, a peasant stood before the cadre, hoping for a fair ruling in a land dispute. His neighbor, wealthier, had already visited the judge's house with gifts, a fine carpet, a purse of coins, perhaps the promise of future favor. The peasant, honest but poor, had only his truth. The verdict, though cloaked in formality, was already decided. Such stories were not rare. While many judges were honorable, the system allowed too much discretion. Records could be altered, witnesses silenced, laws bent quietly. Justice, in the empire, was often sold to the highest bidder. Appointments for sale official positions, from tax collectors to provincial governors, were frequently bought rather than earned. Wealthy men paid large sums to secure offices, knowing they could recoup their investment through taxes, tolls, and gifts. This system, known as iltizam, turned public service into private enterprise. A governor who paid handsomely for his post had no reason to serve the people. His first priority was profit. Schools were neglected, roads crumbled, taxes soared, and when he was replaced, the process began anew. The curse of the middleman. Between the palace and the people stood countless intermediaries, scribes, tax officials, customs agents, clerks. Each had power over paper, and paper held power over lives. A merchant seeking trade permission had to pass through many hands. Each hand expected a fee. A farmer disputing land boundaries needed multiple stamps, each requiring a coin slipped quietly across the desk. Corruption was not merely tolerated, it was institutionalized. Those who refused to pay found their requests delayed, denied, or lost altogether, and so people paid, not just for gain, but to avoid obstruction. Harem politics and hidden influence. Even within the palace, corruption took root, not always in money, but in influence. The imperial harem, a world of its own, wielded quiet but potent power. The Valid Sultan, mother of the reigning sultan, often influenced appointments. So did favored concubines, eunuchs, and palace allies. To gain favor, officials sent lavish gifts, perfumed silks, jeweled trinkets, rare spices. These gestures were not always bribes in name, but in purpose. They served the same function. A whisper from a harem woman could make or unmake careers. Merit often mattered less than connections, and those outside this web of favor remained voiceless. Foreign bribery and diplomatic deception. European ambassadors knew the rules. Ottoman customs, it was said, could be bent with the right offering. Diplomats brought gold, gifts, and flattery. They courted viziers with feasts. They paid interpreters to twist words. They built alliances on coin, not trust. Some Ottoman officials grew fabulously wealthy on foreign bribes. Treaties were influenced, tariffs lowered, trade routes opened, not for benefit of the empire, but for enrichment of the few. The empire's sovereignty, like its justice, became negotiable. The people's resentment. Ordinary subjects knew what happened, even if they couldn't name it. They watched as rich men avoided taxes, while the poor lost homes over a handful of coins. They saw lazy officials grow fat while villages withered. Resentment simmered. Confidence in the state declined. Where once the Sultan was revered as just, he became seen, by some, as distant, misled, or even complicit. Songs and stories reflected this shift. Tales of clever peasants tricking greedy judges, proverbs warning of gold's corruption. Folk, poetry, soft in tone, but sharp in meaning. These were the voices of a tired people. Attempts at reform, not all rulers were blind. Some sultans, alarmed by the decay, tried to purge corruption. New laws were issued, audits performed, officials punished, but change was hard. The rot was deep. Those who benefited resisted. Reforms often faded with the death of the reformer. One sultan might demand honesty, the next would ignore it. Cycles repeated. Hope flickered, then dimmed, and the system endured. Not because it worked well, but because it worked for enough people to keep it in place. The moral weight corruption was not just economic. It was spiritual. Religious leaders warned against it. Sermons denounced greed. Charitable works were praised, but even mosques were not untouched. Some vakafs, charitable foundations, were mismanaged or exploited. Endowments diverted. Wills altered. People struggled to live by virtue in a system that rewarded vice, and many grew cynical, their faith in divine justice stronger than in imperial law. Closing whisper. In the twilight of the empire, when its power still gleamed but its soul ached with exhaustion, corruption clung like dust, unseen from afar, suffocating, up close. It was not dramatic, not always cruel. It was quiet, habitual, and everywhere. And for the average Ottoman subject, it made life heavier, slower, and less fair. In a world of bowed heads and outstretched hands, the true cost of empire was often paid not in blood, but in silence. In the tea houses of Ottoman towns, where the air grew thick with smoke and quiet murmurs drifted between walls of worn stone, men gathered to speak, but never too loudly. Words were chosen carefully. Eyes watched corners. Jokes were masked in riddles. The empire, they knew, had ears. Freedom of speech, a phrase not even formed in their tongue, was a luxury unknown. In the Ottoman world, a slip of the tongue could end a life. A jest against the Sultan, a comment on a local pasha, a line of verse misunderstood. These things could vanish a man from his neighborhood and memory. To speak was to risk. And so, many chose to remain silent. The weight of the word. The empire was built on words. Firm decrees, sacred texts, poetic praise. Language held immense power. It could declare war, sanctify a ruler, soothe a crowd. But with power came danger. Not all words were welcome. Criticism, even if true, was dangerous. The Sultan, revered as the shadow of God on earth, could not be questioned. Officials, appointed by divine favor, were shielded by their position. To call out injustice, to voice dissatisfaction, to share dangerous ideas, these acts threatened not just authority, but the delicate illusion of order. And in an empire where order was sacred, deviation was peril. The scribes and the screeners' books, pamphlets, and written petitions were closely monitored. Scribes copied manuscripts by hand. Printers, when finally permitted in the 18th century, were tightly controlled. Each published work required approval, often from both religious scholars and government censors. Philosophical works from Europe, scientific treatises, or political commentary faced particular scrutiny. Translations of foreign ideas were feared. Enlightenment thought, liberalism, republicanism. These words might as well have been poison. Some books were banned outright. Others were permitted only in Arabic or Persian, unreadable to most common folk. Censorship was not always aggressive, but it was ever present, a quiet net draped over the realm of thought. Spies in the cafe public spaces were not safe from surveillance. Coffee houses, centers of discussion, storytelling, and rumor were viewed with suspicion by authorities. They were places where men lingered, listened, and spoke, and that made them dangerous. So the state sent informants, often low-level bureaucrats, scribes or paid listeners who sat quietly with tea and ears open. They reported on complaints, political whispers, songs sung too boldly. A tavern keeper could be summoned for questioning. A storyteller might disappear after one tale too many. A poet might find himself under watch for rhymes that hinted at rebellion, and so even laughter became measured. Poets and caution poetry was deeply loved in Ottoman society. Sultans composed verse. Courts hosted recitations. But poets knew the line between flattery and peril was thin. They spoke in metaphor, cloaked critique in nature, hid defiance in divine imagery. A line about a wilting rose might refer to a declining dynasty. A cloud's shadow could represent an unjust vizier. Interpretation was everything, and sometimes even careful cloaking could not protect the author. Yet poetry endured, not because it was safe, but because it allowed, if only briefly, the spirit to breathe. The peril of public. Dissent to protest publicly was rare and risky. Crowds could gather for bread, for justice, for anger, but leaders were quickly marked. A shopkeeper who criticized the tax rate too loudly might find his license revoked. A teacher who questioned doctrine could be removed. A preacher who strayed from the approved script might be silenced, or worse. Petitions were allowed, but only through proper channels, carefully worded, respectfully framed. They might be ignored. They might also be noted and remembered, and in many towns, a single informant's report was enough to bring interrogation. Religious suppression and control speech within religious communities was also policed. Non-Muslim clergy were expected to keep sermons within bounds. Political commentary was forbidden. Even within mosques, imams who spoke too freely risked replacement. Sectarian deviation too was watched. Heterodox beliefs, alternative interpretations of faith, these could be labeled heresy. In some cases, Sufi orders faced suspicion. In others, minority Muslim sects were persecuted. Speech was permitted only if it reinforced unity. Dissent, even spiritual, was seen as fracture, whispers in the harem and palace. Even within the palace, freedom of expression was limited. Concubines, eunuchs, and servants all lived under the weight of discretion. One wrong word to the wrong ear could end in exile or execution. Viziers, though powerful, often chose silence over honesty. Advising the Sultan was delicate work. Too blunt, and you might be dismissed. Too meek, and problems festered. It was safer, many believed to agree. Moments of defiance and yet courage bloomed in quiet places. A poet published anonymously. A scholar shared banned texts under candlelight. A storyteller veiled revolution in legend. In taverns after curfew, in deserts beyond control, in hills where officials rarely came, people spoke freely. For a moment, they tasted liberty. These moments were fragile, but they mattered. The cost of silence over time, the price of fear was not only arrests or disappearances, it was stagnation. Ideas failed to flow. Debate diminished. Progress slowed. Young thinkers left the empire, seeking freer skies. Foreign newspapers, smuggled in, became lifelines. But for most, the tongue remained still, and the mind cautious. In a world where truth was dangerous, imagination withered quietly. Closing whisper. Across the Ottoman Empire, words floated like dust, soft, fragile, easily brushed away. The empire feared their power, and so it tried to contain them. But words do not vanish. They wait. In silence, in dreams, in hidden corners, speech survived. But for the living, each day remained a calculation. To speak or to remain safe. To sing or to be silent. And so the people drank tea, told half stories, laughed without joy, and waited for a time when the tongue might be free again. In the early morning hush of a Judeo-Spanish home in Salonika, a candle flickered as prayers were whispered in a language foreign to the empire's courts. A few streets away, a Greek Orthodox bell tolled softly, calling the faithful. Further, still, the Armenian patriarch readied his sermon. All this occurred under the same imperial sky, beneath the same crescent banner. Tolerance, the Ottomans claimed, was their gift to the people. And yet, for the Christians, Jews, and other religious minorities of the Ottoman Empire, that tolerance came wrapped in conditions. Some spoken, some only understood with time. To worship freely was allowed, but never quite equally. To preserve one's faith was possible, but at a cost. The empire's pact with its minorities was fragile, complex, and at times quietly cruel. The millet system, order or division. The Ottoman solution to religious diversity was the millet system, a structure that allowed recognized religious communities to govern themselves in matters of personal law, education, and religious practice. Each millet had a leader, often a patriarch or chief rabbi, who served as both spiritual head and intermediary with the state. On paper, it was an elegant arrangement. Communities preserved their traditions, managed internal disputes, and even collected their own taxes. The empire maintained peace without forced conversions. But the system also created layers of separation. Minorities were not citizens in the modern sense, but subjects of their own millet. They were governed differently, judged differently, treated differently. The lines between communities were visible and rarely crossed. The tax of difference, one of the most tangible burdens on religious minorities, was the saisi, a head tax imposed on non-Muslims. Though framed as a fee for protection, it was also a reminder of subjugation. The tax was public. Men paid it yearly, often in view of Muslim officials. The ritual was humiliating by design, intended to reinforce hierarchy. Those who could not pay faced fines, confiscation, even imprisonment. There were other rules too. Certain professions were restricted. Clothes could be regulated. Weapons were forbidden. Horses were sometimes reserved for Muslims alone. Even mourning rituals or festivals could be curtailed by decree. This was not extermination. It was control. Places of worship, places of mourning, churches and synagogues were permitted, but their construction required permission. They could not be taller than mosques. Bells were silenced. New religious buildings were rare, and repairs could be delayed by bureaucratic walls. In some cities, ancient sanctuaries stood hidden behind plain walls, unmarked, unnoticed, except by the faithful who knew the path. Religious art, music, and ritual persisted, but quietly. Processions were limited, celebrations were muted, even joy had to be measured, and yet the devotion endured. Candles were lit, psalms were sung, scrolls unrolled. Faith bent, but did not break. Conversion. Between heart and survival, conversion to Islam was not officially forced, but it was encouraged in subtle ways. Muslims enjoyed legal privileges. In disputes between Muslims and non-Muslims, Muslim testimony carried greater weight. Muslims paid fewer taxes. They held more offices. In courts, a convert's sincerity was often assumed. For minorities, the temptation was real. Some converted for faith, others for safety. A young orphan, a merchant under debt, a woman facing poverty. Conversion opened doors otherwise closed, but it also severed ties. Converts often lost family, community, and old identity. They gained new burdens in their new life, never quite trusted by either side. And once converted, returning was nearly impossible. Periods of peace, moments of terror. For much of Ottoman history, religious minorities lived in relative peace compared to their counterparts in Western Europe. There were no inquisitions, no wide-scale pogroms sanctioned by the state. Jews expelled from Spain found refuge in Ottoman lands. Christians practiced freely, albeit separately. But this peace was conditional. It depended on obedience, quietness, and political calm. During times of war, rebellion, or external pressure, minorities became convenient scapegoats. A village rumored to shelter enemy sympathizers might be raided. A church accused of disloyalty could be shuttered. Foreign missionaries stirred suspicion. Rumors led to arrests, beatings, even executions. Fear lived just beneath the surface, economy and the outsider's role. Many minorities played crucial roles in commerce, trade, and finance. Armenians managed taxes, Greeks crewed ships, Jews translated documents and managed port trade. Their education, language skills, and international ties made them valuable. But success bred envy. A prosperous minority community could face backlash, legal restrictions, or forced relocation. Protection turned into pressure. Prosperity became precarious, and always they were reminded their wealth, their work, their freedom was permitted, not promised. Interfaith relations. Complex and local daily life among faiths varied widely. In some towns, Christians and Muslims lived side by side, sharing wells, markets, and even lullabies. In others, tension marked every interaction. Friendships existed, so did violence. Marriage across faiths was rare and risky. Children learned early which greetings were safe, which games could lead to trouble. Local dynamics often mattered more than imperial law. A kind governor could foster peace, a cruel one could unravel it overnight. Faith, like fire, warmed or burned depending on the wind. Survival, through silence. Many minorities learned to live small. They kept faith inside homes. They taught children caution. They wrote histories in hidden script. They smiled in public, sighed in private. And yet, they preserved. Songs endured. Prayers adapted. Old languages survived on lips and parchment. Through war, famine, and decree, the thread of belief held. It was not just survival. It was resistance, quiet, steady, sacred. Closing. Whisper, the Ottoman Empire prided itself on tolerance, and in many ways it gave space where others offered none. But that space was narrow, and its boundaries were marked by power. For the Christian, the Jew, the Zoroastrian, the heretic, the empire's embrace was cautious. It held them, but not as equals. It permitted, but did not welcome. And so they lived, faithful, fearful, and full of hope that someday the hand upon their shoulder might not feel so heavy. In a small Ottoman courtyard, sheltered by fig trees and the soft rustle of laundry swaying on ropes, a young girl traced letters in dust with a stick. She had no paper, no ink, no formal teacher, but her fingers moved with determination. From a doorway, her grandmother watched silently, neither encouraging nor stopping her. In a world shaped by men's voices, the girl's quiet practice was its own quiet defiance. Women in the Ottoman Empire lived within walls, physical, legal, and cultural. Their voices, though soft, were steady. Their knowledge, though limited, by design, sought space to grow. In this part of the world, and in this chapter of history, education for women was not outlawed, but it was constrained. Expression was not banned, but it was heavily veiled. The empire did not silence its women through force alone. Often, it did not have to. A childhood of boundaries. From an early age, Ottoman girls were trained in the rhythms of modesty. Their movements, dress, and speech were guided by custom. Education, if it came, focused on domesticity, sewing, cooking, managing a household, behaving with grace. In wealthier families, girls sometimes received tutoring. A governess or male teacher might teach basic literacy, Quranic recitation, or arithmetic. But learning beyond these essentials was rare. Philosophy, history, or science were considered unnecessary, even dangerous. For the poor, schooling was almost unheard of. A girl's future was shaped not by books, but by marriage arrangements, dowry calculations, and family expectations. To be too clever, too curious, too expressive, these were not considered virtues. The harem, luxury, and limitation. Contrary to Western fantasy, the imperial harem was not a den of indulgence, but a highly structured world of discipline, hierarchy, and politics. Women here lived in refinement but also in isolation. They were taught music, poetry, embroidery, etiquette. Some learned multiple languages. Some became skilled in diplomacy. But even the most educated harem women rarely interacted with the world, beyond the palace. Their knowledge served the state, not themselves. Some became powerful, mothers of sultans, political influencers behind the curtain, yet their influence remained unofficial. Their voices filtered through male advisors or palace intermediaries, and those who did not rise remained shadows behind silk screens. Ordinary women, extraordinary silence. Beyond the palace, Ottoman women worked tirelessly in fields, homes, and workshops. They spun thread, baked bread, raised children. They kept family accounts, healed the sick, and held communities together. But their wisdom remained oral, their contributions undocumented. Few women wrote, fewer were published. Their stories passed from mother to daughter in lullabies, recipes, and whispered advice. There were poets, of course, rare and remarkable, women like Fitnat Hanım, whose verses were known in 18th century Istanbul. But their names were few. Their words, often framed through male commentary, to express was to risk exposure, and so many simply did not. Marriage, a contract, not a conversation. Marriage, the cornerstone of a woman's public life, was rarely a matter of her choosing. Arranged by family, influenced by dowry and status, it was more transaction than union. Wives were expected to obey, bear children, manage the household. Love, if it came, was a bonus. Divorce existed, but the process favoured men. Women could petition for divorce under certain conditions: abuse, abandonment, impotence. But the burden of proof was high, and societal shame loomed large. Widows had more freedom. Some managed businesses, inherited wealth, lived independently. But they too navigated society's suspicion. An outspoken widow could easily become a target of gossip or worse. Religious education, a path with limits. In religious contexts, women were encouraged to learn to recite the Quran and observe proper rituals. Some attended mosque lectures from behind latticed screens. Others studied with respected female scholars, mudarisla, who quietly passed on religious knowledge to other women. But the path ended where public discourse began. Female religious teachers existed, but never led prayer. Their opinions held value, privately. The doors to ijtihad, independent reasoning, or formal jurisprudence, remained closed. Their questions were welcome, their answers less so. Stories in thread and song deprived of ink and platform, women found expression in other ways. Embroidery became narrative. Patterns told stories of sorrow, love, resistance. Each stitch carried memory. Songs passed down at weddings, and birth spoke of longing, injustice, joy. Lullabies were full of coded grief. Kitchen conversations, shared in the hush of dawn, became oral chronicles. These were archives of feeling, culture, and endurance, unwritten but unforgettable. The rise of women's voices, too late for most by. The 19th century, change stirred. Schools for girls were founded, especially in urban centres. The Tanzimat reforms introduced ideas of modernization, and with them came a slow shift in attitudes toward women's roles. Magazines edited by women began to appear. Topics ranged from fashion to family ethics, sometimes touching, cautiously, on education and rights. But for most women, especially in rural areas, these changes remained distant. The reforms touched the surface, not the roots, and the vast majority continued to live, work, and die unheard. What was lost? In silencing women, the empire lost half its voice. Ideas went unspoken, art was stifled, healing knowledge disappeared. Solutions to problems, local, domestic, moral, were left unexplored. The state preserved control, but it sacrificed wisdom, and women, brilliant and bound, became legends only in private memory. Closing whispering. The quiet rooms of the Ottoman world, behind carved doors and shaded windows, women lived lives of richness, sorrow, and unspoken brilliance. They dreamed in silence. They questioned without reply. They endured. Their stories, like smoke, drifted up but were never recorded. Their poems were sung, then forgotten. Their thoughts, profound and private, vanished with them. And the empire, though mighty, remained poorer for never truly listening. In a dusty Ottoman village, under the shade of a withered tree near the mosque, an old man sat quietly on a wooden bench. His hands, twisted with years of labour, rested on his knees. His eyes watched children chase a ball of rags across the square, though his gaze was distant. He had lived through wars, plagues, and harvests, and now, in the last stretch of life, he waited, not for joy, but for the long hush of death. Aging in the Ottoman Empire was not cushioned by pensions or gentle retirement. Time did not slow. It pressed harder. Bodies bent, strength left quietly, and those who could no longer work faded into the background. There were moments of reverence for the old, but no system to carry them. And as death approached, the rituals that followed were solemn, sacred, and filled with silence. The unfolding of old age few people in the Ottoman Empire lived past their 60s. Illness, injury, childbirth, and hardship claimed most lives young. To become elderly was, in many ways, a lonely triumph. The elderly often lived with their children, if they had any still surviving. In rural areas, extended families shared homes. Grandparents helped raise the young, passed on wisdom, or tended gardens. But if they could no longer contribute, they became dependent. There was no state support, no care homes. The sick or weak were cared for if family could manage. If not, they were left to neighbours' charity or to God. In towns, beggars were, often old. Widows especially suffered. An aged woman without sons or brothers might live in a back room, surviving on bread and mercy. Memory and loss. With age came stories. The old remembered what others had forgotten. When the river last froze, when locusts came, when the Sultan died. They told tales of wars survived, loves lost, fortunes made and undone. But often, no one listened. Children were too busy, adults too tired, and the stories, though precious, began to fade with the tellers. Old age also brought loss. Friends died. Siblings disappeared. Spouses passed in sleep or suffering. Grief settled like dust. The elderly smiled at weddings, but thought of funerals. And in the quiet moments, many wondered not just when they would go, but who would remember them when they did. Preparation for the end death was not a stranger in the Ottoman world. It was expected, discussed, prayed for. The Quran reminded believers of mortality. So did church bells and synagogue chants. As the body weakened, preparations began. Final prayers were learned. Wills, if possible, were spoken aloud or written. Debts were paid, apologies offered, forgiveness sought. Some people visited their own grave plots, chosen in advance, prepared with care. Others asked to be buried with a Quran, a rosary, or a family heirloom. Those who could afford it arranged their shrouds ahead of time, white linen, simple and clean. The poor hoped the community would provide. Death was not hidden. It was anticipated with humility. Dying at home. Most people died in their own homes. Doctors were rare. Death came in sleep, in pain, or in silence. Family gathered. Neighbours brought food. Women washed the body with warm water and rose oil. The process was sacred, gentle, slow, filled with prayers and whispered blessings. The dead were wrapped in white, men by men, women by women, eyes closed, mouth tied, limbs straightened. The soul, they believed, lingered a while, watching. The body was carried to the mosque, church, or synagogue. Eulogies were rare. Instead, prayers spoke of mercy, not memory, of God's will, not human grief. The burial graves in the Ottoman Empire were simple for most. A headstone marked the name, the dates, perhaps a phrase of peace. Wealthier families had ornate markers, marble tombs, carved turbans, poetic inscriptions. Cemeteries were often on hills or beside holy places. Cypress trees stood watch, their tall forms symbols of eternity. Women sometimes scattered herbs. Children placed stones. But soon, life resumed. The mourning house emptied. The dead returned to the earth and the living to their labours. Mourning and memory. Mourning was structured. By faith, Muslims observed 3 days, with extended grief in some cases reaching 40. Christians held memorial services. Jews recited Kaddish, often daily for weeks. Clothing changed, black worn, hair left uncut, celebrations postponed. But as time passed, grief became private. A widow wore sadness in her eyes, not her dress. A son visited the grave alone, quietly. A mother lit candles each week without speaking of the child she'd lost. Memory was not institutionalized. It lived in habit, not calendar. What came after? Hopes and heaven. For many in the Ottoman world, death was not the end, but the beginning of the soul's journey. Muslims believed in barzakh, the intermediate state, and awaited the day of judgment. The righteous would enter gardens of bliss, the wicked, flames. But God's mercy, they believed, was vast. Christians anticipated resurrection. Jews spoke of return. Each faith imagined rest, reunion, or reckoning. Grave markers asked for prayers. Some warned the living to prepare. "As I am, you shall be," read one common phrase. Death was not feared in terror, but accepted with awe. Those forgotten, not all, were buried with prayer. The poor, the enslaved, the criminal, the outcast. Many were laid to rest in unmarked ground. No procession, no lament, just earth and wind. And yet, even these souls were remembered in whispers. A neighbor prayed. A stranger dropped a coin in charity. A child asked, "Who was he?" And for a moment, they were not forgotten. Closing whisper time ruled the Ottoman world with a quiet fist. It shaped faces, broke backs, took friends. It left old women bent over looms, old men gazing at nothing, children burying fathers too soon. But through it all, the people endured. They marked life not in wealth, but in memory, not in legacy, but in love. And when they passed, they left, behind more than silence. They left stories, some written, some stitched, some sung beneath breath. The empire stood on their shoulders. And then, as gently as nightfall, they were gone. From afar, the Ottoman Empire shimmered like a mirage, golden domes glinting beneath a cloudless sky, bazaars overflowing with spices and silk, palaces adorned in tile and light. Visitors from Europe spoke of its majesty. Sultans were likened to Caesars, their reach vast, their word divine. But for those who lived within its breath, its streets, its villages, its courts and kitchens, the truth was more tangled. Yes, the empire held greatness, but that greatness often masked hardship. Its glory was real, but uneven. Its triumphs carved from the labor of countless unseen hands. And for many, the empire's grandeur became a kind of cage, polished, proud, but quietly suffocating. A world of ceremonies and silences. The empire moved with ritual. From the courtly procession of the Sultan to the call to prayer echoing across city domes, every action had a pattern. Officials bowed in practiced arcs. Letters bore stamped seals. Even meals in the palace followed a choreography of silence, waiting, gesture. This formality gave shape to power. It impressed, it endured, but it also limited. Those within its bounds learned not to question. Innovation stalled. Fear replaced flexibility. The empire's beauty became its armor and its shackle. Splendor for the few. The Topkapi Palace dazzled with gilded ceilings and Persian carpets. Imperial mosques stretched toward heaven with impossible grace. But these spaces were built by hands blistered in stone dust. The wealth that sustained them was drawn from the toil of distant peasants, caravan laborers, and heavily taxed artisans. The court dressed in furs and pearls while children in the provinces ate barley gruel. Even in good times, inequality hummed beneath the surface. And in bad times, famine, plague, defeat, the splendor remained untouched, while the poor suffered unseen. Grandeur demanded illusion, and illusions demand distance. The burden of conquest territory was pride. Maps painted the empire in sweeping arcs: North Africa, the Balkans, the Middle East. Conquest fed ego, but it also fed instability. Every new province brought diversity, but also disunity. Different languages, laws, and loyalties had to be managed. This required force, funds, and faith in a system that grew increasingly strained. The more the empire grew, the more it needed to control. And the harder that became, the more tightly it clutched, often crushing what it meant to protect. At some point, the empire stopped expanding for greatness. It expanded to avoid collapse. Resistance. Within the walls, not all bowed quietly. Rebellions flared, peasants against taxes, provinces against governors, factions against reform. Bandits became folk heroes, dissenters became poets, but these voices were rarely honored. Most were silenced, not celebrated. The empire, proud and slow, struggled. To adapt, reformers tried. Tanzimat laws promised equality. Sultans spoke of modernity. But every step forward brought backlash from those who feared change. Janissaries, clerics, nobles. And so progress came late, uneven, unfinished. The empire's grandeur made it resistant to correction. Its pride, both crown and chain. The palace, as prison, even the sultans, figures of awe and absolute power, were not free. Raised in luxury, shielded from the world, many grew up in isolation. In the later centuries, young princes were confined in the cafes, the cage, a section of the palace designed to prevent rival claims. These future rulers spent years in gilded solitude, surrounded by eunuchs and silence. Some emerged broken, others paranoid. Few understood the world they were to govern. Their rule, though supreme in name, was often manipulated by viziers, mothers, or military cliques. The throne was not always a seat of strength, but of constraint. Power, in the Ottoman context, did not always mean freedom. The spectacle of stability to the outside world, the empire projected strength. Public executions, elaborate ceremonies, grand architecture, all were staged to display control. But these displays often hid fragility. The janissaries who marched with precision were also prone to riot. The governors who bowed in loyalty sometimes ruled as kings in their own provinces. Each parade, each feast, each public sermon was a rehearsal of harmony, not proof of it. And the need for such spectacle only grew as internal stability waned. The invisible suffering, for the vast majority, farmers, women, artisans, slaves, the empire's glory offered no protection. Their daily lives were shaped by drought, tax collectors, disease, and laws they could not read. They were not enemies of the empire. They were its foundation. And yet, their voices rarely reached the center. Their needs were secondary. Their losses unrecorded. Their stories, if told, came through lullabies, graves, and worn hands, not history books. Grandeur did not feed them. It merely used them. Decline with dignity. Europe industrialized and global empires rose. The Ottomans clung to an older model. Railroads came late. Schools were limited. Factories stumbled. The empire was proud, but tired. And when collapse came, it was not sudden. It came like twilight, slow, soft, undeniable. Territories were lost. Wars drained the treasury. Reforms came too late. Revolutions stirred. The 20th century would sweep the empire away. But even as it faded, its illusions held. Firm, the domes still shone. The flags still flew. The past was revered. The present endured. The gilded cage, in the end. The Ottoman Empire was both magnificent and mournful. Its domes and palaces remain today, not only as monuments to glory, but as reminders of what was. Not seen, the hunger, the silence, the hidden sorrow. Its greatness was real, but so was its suffering. It offered safety, but with strings. Beauty, but with burden. Unity, but without equality. And for those inside its walls, the empire was not just a homeland or a ruler. It was a cage of customs, expectations, and dreams, too dangerous to voice. A gilded cage, polished by centuries, but still a cage. Closing. Whisper, and so ends this long tale, whispered gently across the ages, through the dust of markets and the echo of stone courtyards. The Ottoman Empire was not merely a place or a time. It was a rhythm of living, a balance of pride and pain, tradition and trial, seen from far as glorious, but known up close as human. And in the quiet, after the last call to prayer, beneath the same stars that once watched over sultans and shepherds, alike, one truth remains. Even the grandest empire cannot escape the softness of its people's sorrow.